Hey, welcome to Lesson 7. Today we are discussing Toni Morrison's short story. Before we dive in, let's talk about the author very briefly. Now, Toni Morrison, she was born in February 18th, 1931. Below you see her real name, Chloe Ardelia Wofford. Now, she adopted her surname after her husband and stuck with Toni for her pen name. She graduated from Cornell University, where she completed her master's degree there in 1955. So this was a time where it was still unusual to have African Americans getting degrees, especially women, especially females. Morrison was, in fact, the first African American to hold later on the position of a senior editor at Random House or at a significant publishing house. And she used her position there to shepherd careers of many black writers, including, for example, Henry Dumas, Michelle Cliff, and Angela Davis. Likewise, she was the first black woman to hold a chair at an Ivy League university. So as you see, she's a woman of many firsts. Likewise, she is the first black woman to win the Nobel Prize, and she won it in 1993. Now, recitative, the title, right? We'll talk about it in just a second. But the short story was published in 1983, and it was the first short story that Toni Morrison ever published, and it's one of the two that she has ever actually, up until today, published. She published one after this one. Toni Morrison is definitely much more of an author who is very familiar with the novel form, and I think this comes through in this story. It is almost as if divided into separate chapters. Now, the title, again, has sparked much critical speculation on its significance. Again, the recitative is the French form of the recitative, which is the segment of the opera or an operette that is kind of spoken. It's often accompanied by chords in the background, but it's kind of spoken, half sung in a way that resembles speech. And it basically is the part where we fill in the audience on the plot, and we try to speed through that. So in a sense, it's the binding between the good parts of the opera, right? And so the parts that are sung. So if the story is a kind of recitative, then the narrator in that case, Twyla, is the performer. She is telling us how she remembered the events. This is contrasted with her friend Roberta's claims, right? Or at least the way what she claims, what she has remembered. And this is actually a common element of Morrison's fiction. Memory is very often not consistent with characters in her works, and it provides the key to the central connection between the main characters. Essentially, this story, it concerns Twyla Benson and Roberta Fisk Norton, who meet 5 times over the course of their lives, at least over the course of this story, and discuss their differences and similarities, notably concerning their memories of Maggie, who is this disabled kitchen worker at St. Bonnie's. There are 2 games really that Morrison plays here with her readers over the course of this story. One concerning memory, and the second one, and I think more important one, concerning race. Now, as far as the 2 girls are concerned, Twyla and Roberta aren't given any definitive markers as to their race except for the names. We are told that one is salt, the other pepper, one is white, the other black. Now, because Toni Morrison is writing in first person from the perspective of Twyla, I think most readers will assume that Twyla is the black girl, while Roberta is the white one, possibly half Latino. And this will be mostly consistent with what their names suggest as well. However, some scholars note that readers might arrive at different conclusions based on their own experiences and their own references. In a later dialogue exchange, which we will discuss, the girls cannot agree whether Maggie, the kitchen worker at St. Bonnie's, was black or white. And this kind of suggests that the ambivalence of race is part of the experiment. It's part of Toni Morrison's game. Now, if having read the story you had imagined that Twyla was the black and Roberta was the white girl, try to re-envision the story once again in your mind, except this time having the races flipped. Think of all the implications that would kind of create. Another important question to ask yourself as we're examining the story is, do you think that the racial differences are at the root of the division that separates these two girls? In other words, can you imagine the same story told where both of these girls are either black or white? So let's dive in. Let us begin and consider such a question. Okay, so first of the 5 sections is set at St. Bonaventuras, or St. Bonnie's as the characters call it. It's the shelter for children. We know that Twyla and Roberta are roommates who eventually get along with each other. So what do they find in common? Okay, so first off, we're told that they both get Fs, so failing grades, though the narrator claims that they get them for different reasons. They both weren't real orphans, unlike the rest of the children at the shelter, except again, both of their mothers can't raise them for very different reasons. And finally, they are both united by the fear and fascinations of the big girls in the shelter, though neither of them would admit it to the other, right? So it's as if they were kind of unaware that they had this other thing in common. At least it wasn't stated openly. They might have sensed it. But I hope that you're noticing something interesting here. It seems that all the commonalities that the girls share can also be divisions, depending on how you draw the line. One can't read, the other has a bad memory, right? So this is why they get Fs. Roberta's mom is too sick to care for her, while Twyla's mom likes to dance all night. And I hope that you get this euphemism, right? Twyla's mom likes to party. Perhaps she even works as a prostitute. When the two girls' mothers meet, Roberta's mother refuses to shake Twyla's mother's hand. This takes us back to the idea of arbitrariness of race. Now, what we mean by that is that the scene makes sense regardless of how we deal the race cards, right? Roberta's mom can be refusing to shake Twyla's mother's hand, either because she's racist, black or white, it doesn't matter, or because she considers Twyla's mother to be a, quote, whore, right? So remember that Twyla herself is ashamed of how her mother dressed for the occasion. And the third option is, of course, a mix of both of these reasons. So you see, Roberta's mother's race doesn't really affect the reading of the scene. Probably the most important episode, however, that occurs at St. Bonnie's is the witnessing of Maggie tripping in the orchard, because this event is later revisited when the two girls meet years later. Notice that in the description of Maggie's character, Twyla mentions that she is sandy-colored. This is important because later on the two girls argue as to her race. Was she black? Was she white? We can take this as a sort of again, part of the game that Morrison is playing with her readers. When she writes sandy-colored, the reader is left free to draw their own conclusions as to what that means. Is she referring to her hair color, her skin, her clothes? Later on, when Roberta claims that Maggie was black, the reader, just like Twyla, might doubt their own memory and return to the original description of the character to see if they remembered correctly. But since the description itself is ambiguous, they were, in a sense, tricked into doubting their own memory, just like Twyla was. Now, the second time the girls meet is years later. Twyla is working at Howard Johnson's when her older roommate shows up with two men who are, quote, smothered in head and facial hair. Roberta herself wears a lot of makeup, which kind of suggests to us that she might have been impressed by the big girls at St. Bonnie's all along. She tells Twyla that her boyfriend has an appointment with Jimi Hendrix on the West Coast, but Twyla doesn't even know who Hendrix is. Again, this creates ambiguity over which girl is black and white. Jimi Hendrix, for those of you who are unfamiliar with classic rock, is considered to this day by various critics to have been the best rock and roll guitarist of all times. Now, you see his picture here. Now, he gained popularity in a time where the music scene was dominated by mostly white bands, and actually mostly British ones, the so-called British Invasion. And Jimmy's fan base was actually largely white. So again, Twyla's ignorance and Roberta's knowledge of Hendrix can be understood differently. If Twyla is black, then perhaps we could see this as a commentary that Hendrix, a black guitarist, was appropriated by the white crowd. If she is white, then the insinuation is that she doesn't know Hendrix because he is either a black guitarist, or, and this would be more likely, because she simply does not partake in the 60s counterculture. The third time that the girls meet, they're both grown up. Right? Twyla is married, and she runs into Roberta, who now lives in a nearby upper-class community where a lot of IBM workers were told live. And she has 4 boys. All of them, of course, are stepchildren. Now, Twyla herself has a son, and like I said, she's married. But obviously, Roberta is living much better than she is. Now, the two seem to reconnect like old times at the shelter, and they reminisce. But Twyla asks Roberta about, the reason why she was kind of snubbed to her at Howard Johnson's, and Roberta's not sure herself why she acted the way she did, but she says, "Oh, Twyla, you know how it was in those days, black and white. You know how everything was." Now, this is the first time that Tony begins to consciously play this with this idea, with concept of memory. Right? Both women have different memories of the 60s, it seems. One remembers them as a time of some sort of racial division or even strife. This is Roberta, of course. While Twyla remembers them as a time when blacks and whites got along especially well. And you can see this here in this highlighted section. We see this divergence of memory here in the scene, and is perhaps caused by Roberta's need to defend herself after being rude to Twyla in the past. So we're not sure if she actually remembers the 60s differently, or whether she is simply lying. Still, we go back to the theme of arbitrariness of race. We learned that Twyla married a firefighter, while Roberta married a rich widower who gave her everything for free, basically, including 4 children, which she doesn't have to, give birth to. And here we are told that Twyla thinks of Roberta's progress, that she says something to the sort that everything was so easy for, quote, them. Now, we're not sure who she is referring to. It is likely that she is suggesting that, them means white people, suggesting that Roberta was able to advance higher in society, higher in the class structure than she was, simply because she was white. Now, knowing the realities of US, a reversed racial reading of this would make less sense. However, Twyla might be simply referring to the rich upper class without really commenting on the race. Maybe them stands for rich people. Whatever the case, we know that Twyla is jealous of Roberta, though she does not openly admit as much. The 4th meeting occurs over a series of protests. Twyla sees her old friend Roberta picketing with a sign that reads, "Mothers have rights too." Roberta is defensive about her picketing, and she says, "Maybe I'm different now, Twyla," she admits. But then she recalls how back in the shelter, Twyla once kicked a poor black lady when she was on the ground. Now notice that it is Roberta who accuses Twyla of having pushed and kicked a black lady, and then she says, quote, "And you have the nerve to call me a bigot," Roberta says. Now, this scene would perhaps make more sense if it was a black girl accusing a white girl of having pushed a black lady, right? Her accusation of bigotry or racism would have been well-grounded. But here the wording of the dialogue makes at least two readings of the scene possible. Either Roberta is accusing Twyla of racism for having pushed a black lady, or she is inferring that Twyla, because of her unethical behavior in the past, is in no position to pass any moral judgment on her right now. So if the latter is the case, then we might infer that Roberta is picketing against integration, and hence she's the white one, right? And she feels guilty when she sees her black friend. That's one likely possibility. Still, the fact that the girls can't agree as to Maggie's race, we can infer that Morrison planned, or at least purposely left out clear demarcations as to the girls' race, the two girls' race is concerned, because this was, part of her conscious strategy. So we can formulate a few hypotheses. One might be that Roberta is once again trying to hide a feeling of guilt by altering memories, right? By saying that, not only did Twyla kick Maggie, but Maggie was also black. And basically she's doing this to mislead Twyla into feeling a similar guilt. The second hypothesis is that Twyla, who, because of her envy of Roberta's status, right, because she's richer than her, that Twyla is in fact an unreliable narrator, and she is consciously misleading us, the reader, as to her own memories. Now recall that in the original description, Maggie was said to be of sandy color, so we see that this might be also a possibility. The fifth time they meet, and this is a few years later, Twyla is still bothered by these accusations that she kicked an old black woman, and she wonders if she could be wrong and if Maggie was actually black, but then she seems to remember that she never actually kicked Maggie, black or white, right? Twyla concludes therefore that Roberta remembered the incident incorrectly. Twyla and Roberta have another reunion in a restaurant. It's during Christmas, right before Christmas, and Roberta admits that she herself was not sure if Maggie was black or not. More importantly, she admits that Twyla did not kick the woman. She does not want Twyla to feel guilty about something she did not do, right? So after this revelation, she breaks down and she starts crying. And again, race seems arbitrary to this scene as well. Instead, what finally brings these two characters back together is their ability to agree on what they remembered, so their memories. So what do you think Morrison is trying to say through this? What does the fact that, what finally brings these two together is when they finally are able to agree about what happened. Well, perhaps Morrison is trying to point out that human perception and memory are, in fact, things that create real divides between people. Now, race is arbitrary unless either side chooses to use it as a weapon. Right. Now, this being said, the final question that we are left with is, why does Roberta break down and cry for Maggie? What could Maggie's character possibly symbolize for these two? Now, hopefully we will be able to share our thoughts about this during our next meeting together.